Hello and welcome to this week's discussion about understanding the Israel-Palestine conflict. So this is a conflict which is perhaps the most controversial contested conflict in the world today. And of course the contest is between those who see Israel as defending itself against external threats as being the only democracy in the Middle East, as they usually say, versus those who see it as a settler colonial power against which there is Palestinian resistance, not terrorism, as the Israelis would call it. So you have a key distinction there in the battle for definitions on what the conflict's about. So how should we understand it? What kind of way of thinking about this is most appropriate? Is it a conflict? When did it start? How did it start? What's the conflict over? What is the occupation? And I'm going to ask you to stop the slides in a minute, in fact now, and answer these questions. Just jot these down and see what you think about them, and then come back to them at the end and see what you think then, see if you've changed your mind. Who occupies the occupied territories? Easy one-word answer, two-word answer to that, isn't there? What do you think? Who is it that occupies the territories? Who started, what started the conflict? Why is there a conflict in Israel-Palestine? And where did the Palestinian refugees come from? What does that mean? Where did the Palestinian refugees come from? So, stop the slides just now, write that down for 5 minutes and come back, okay? And when you come back, you see this graphic I gave last week as well in the Northern Ireland lecture on the question of settler colonialism being still a reality, notably in the USA, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, which we often don't think about as being settler colonial states, because of course the reason for that is that the natives have been more or less entirely killed as part of the process of settlement. The Native Americans, First Nations in Canada, the Aboriginal people and the Maori in New Zealand, all killed by the settlers as a deliberate question of policy. And the ones who survive are not able to exert their voice, to exert any significant political power. There's just not enough of them. And then you look at the question of Palestine and whether that is a question of settler colonialism in the same way as Northern Ireland perhaps is, or America or Australia was. And that's the question really. Is this a settler colonial conflict, or is it a question of, as some of the pro-Israel people say, a matter of national liberation and self-determination for the Jewish people? And that's the nub of the conflict over the contest over the conflict. Well, I mean, television news is the main source of information for most people in Britain on the conflict. But what they see and hear is so confused and partial, it's impossible to have a sensible public debate about the reasons for the conflict or how it might be resolved, according to Greg File and Mike Berry, former colleagues of mine from the University of Glasgow and Cardiff. And I'm going to give you a little bit more from this article, which you can see in the link at the bottom there. So the result is that there is almost nothing on the news about the history and origins of the conflict. Viewers are extraordinarily confused. Many believe that the Palestinians were occupying the occupied territories, or that it was basically a border dispute between two countries who were trying to grab a piece of land which separated them. The great bulk of those who were interviewed had no idea where the Palestinian refugees had come from. Some suggested they come from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and even from Kosovo. Without the history or context, the news tends to report on day-to-day events, in which case what one gets is the Israeli view much more than the Palestinian view, or the US view of US politicians who tend to be pro-Israel, even above British politicians on British television news. And there's the book from 2004, and there's a video there which summarises the findings of the book, which you can have a look at. Here, of course, is the famous diagram of Palestinian loss of land from 1947. to 1948 to 1949, and then to the present day, where the remaining parts of the territories are becoming more and more encroached upon by settlements, by illegal settlements, illegal under international law. So we have on the television news competing, deeply contested histories of the conflict. We have competing explanations of the causes of violence. And then the question is, which explanatory themes are present in news coverage, and whose narratives shape the news reporting of the conflict? And what we find is the Israelis tend to dominate, and here we have some Israeli propaganda materials suggesting that Hamas attacks Israel, and it's only when Israel makes a minor response that the television news reports this. This, of course, is false, but that is the kind of view that one gets from Israel, including the idea of what would you do if there were missiles raining down on New York, London, or Paris, and to make an equivalence between that and the illegal occupation of Gaza is the attempt. But when we look at, in reality, at the actual conflict that there is there, we see that overwhelmingly the people who die are Palestinians, including many, many children who are killed by the Israelis. And this is the data from B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization. And this is true of all the different sub-conflicts that have been between the Israelis and the Palestinians. A massive disparity of deaths. Here we are, January to July 2014, and you can see the blue deaths there on the left are the deaths of Israelis, and the red deaths are of Palestinians, 76% of which are civilians. So 3/4 of all people killed are civilians, killed by the Israelis. And then there's this study that I'm mentioning. There was an audience study. TV news was the primary source of information about the conflict for many people, and gaps and absences in the understanding exactly parallel the gaps in the news. Okay, so there's the question of the occupation, because Israeli presence is not described as a military occupation, and the significance of this is not explained. It's not clear what the word occupation actually meant. Some understood it to mean simply that people were on the land, as in a bathroom being occupied. Now, so we're going to go on to talk about Zionism and terrorism, and about the state of Israel, and look at the historical context and the ways in which the use of the term terrorism emerges. What is Zionism? Zionism is a political ideology devoted to the creation of the state of Israel, and then, of course, its maintenance after its creation in 1948. Some of the context of the emergence of Zionism, which emerges at the end of the 19th century, over 120 years ago now. And in that context, from that period up to the present, questions of anti-Semitism, nationalism, European colonialism, and secularization, all of these are key parts of the development of the movement of Zionism. And here is Brian Klug, one of the more sophisticated writers on anti-Semitism, talking about what it is and how it's a racist fantasy about Jews, which allows Jews to be racialized in such a way that as a racial group they can be victims of racism, such as, for example, in the Holocaust, where Jews were killed simply for being Jews. And that's the way in which racism works, is that you racialize a group so that they come to seem like a race, i.e. a group of people who are defined as being negative in relation to another group, in particular white people. Nationalism, the rise of the national state from the French Revolution onwards, the idea of an imagined political community, of course, is part of this process. And colonialism and secularization, the modern period brings with it a decline in religiosity amongst both Christians and Jews and other populations too. And the rise of colonialism, of course, and its decline is part of the story of the creation of the state of Israel, as you will see shortly. Here we have the founder, if you like, of Zionism, famously wrote Der Judenstaat at the end of the 1800s in 1896. Theodor Herzl. A town is named after him just north of Tel Aviv in Israel called Herzliya. He's the sort of founding father of the Zionist movement and indeed of the State of Israel effectively. And colonialism, the Zionists were influenced by colonialism, by the ideas of colonialism. By Cecil Rhodes, the founder of De Beers Diamonds. They lobbied the Ottoman Sultan, the Kaiser of Germany. They lobbied the Prime Minister of the UK, Neville Chamberlain, for the creation of a Jewish state. Chamberlain offered them some territory in Uganda, but Herzl died only a few months after that, and the idea was dropped. What do the Zionists believe? They believe that we must be prepared. This is Israel Zangwill from the Zionist movement from Manchester in 1905. We must be prepared either to drive out by the sword the tribes in possession as our forefathers did, or to grapple with the problem of a large alien population. So there's the idea back in 1905 that they would have to militarily get rid of the native population were they to create a Jewish state. And here's Ben Gurion, the socialist who was the first prime minister of Israel. In the area allocated to the Jewish state, there are not more than 500,000 Jews and about 350,000 non-Jews, mostly Arabs. Together, the total population will be about 1 million. Such a composition does not provide a stable basis for a Jewish state. This demographic fact must be viewed in all its clarity and acuteness. With such a population, there cannot even be absolute certainty that control will remain in the hands of the Jewish majority. And so you can see there a very clear idea that this was something which was going to be controlled. That it wasn't a question of a state for all its people, land for all its people. It was a state which would be controlled by the majority, and they had to have sufficient majority in order to do that. And the parallels with the state of Northern Ireland are very striking in that passage, I think. And here is the Foreign Office in 1917, the famous Balfour Declaration, going along with the idea that there would be the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And this is what leads to, some 30 years later, the creation of the State of Israel. Here we have Mandate Palestine. The familiar yellow bit is the shape of Israel today, and the pink bit is what was called Transjordan at the time. But that was the whole area that the British at that stage occupied. And here was the plan, the UN plan for the partition of Palestine. You can see Gaza, West Bank, and much larger territory than actually was gained with the creation of the State of Israel. So the cost for the Palestinians in what's called the War of Independence by the Israelis and called Al-Nakba, the disaster by the Palestinians. Some 800,000 Palestinian refugees are displaced, and many of these people and their descendants remain refugees to this day. Some of them went to the West Bank and to Gaza, others went to Syria, to Lebanon, to Egypt, to Jordan. And they to this day remain, their descendants remain refugees. They've not been able to go back. And you can see the distinct geographical units that became the West Bank and Gaza after the 1949 armistice. And then in 1967, the West Bank and Gaza were invaded by Israel and occupied, illegally occupied, as was the Golan Heights in the north there, and in the south, the Sinai Desert, which was occupied militarily, taken from Egypt and given back in 1979. Here's the famous UN Security Council Resolution 242, which which of course emphasises the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, i.e. that Israel shouldn't have invaded and occupied is against international law. And the calls for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from the territories occupied in the recent conflict, that is the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. Then post-67, the United States becomes a key sponsor of Israel. One of the reasons that they are to some extent protected from international opinion. Settlement building begins in the occupied territories, and there's the growth of religious Zionism in Israel and the United States. And here again is the famous diagrams with the encroachment of the settlements into Palestinian territory. And the same can be seen in Jerusalem. And here we are in the blue there, Jerusalem prior to 1967, and then since 1967, expansion of Jewish settlements throughout the territory taken by force by the Israeli military. And again, of course, this is in contravention of international law. The response of the Palestinians, eventually in 1964, the creation of the Palestine Liberation Organization and its engagement in armed struggle, mainly against military targets, but not all, some civilian also targeted, including the bombing of buses and supermarkets. And here is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine's Leila Khaled, the sort of poster girl for revolutionary armed struggle in the 1960s, and that's her at the bottom there in more recent years with a photograph from her back in the day. You can see there's a documentary about her called The Orange Tree, which is worth watching to get her story. Now we come to revisionist Zionism. This is the contrast between revisionist Zionism and Labour Zionism is worth making. This dominant strand of Zionist state building was Labour Zionism, which kind of melded together some elements of socialist ideas, the idea of the kibbutz and the cooperative and working together on the land to build a new society, even although the land had been effectively stolen from people who had previously owned it. This was still regarded as being some kind of socialist experiment. And that is comes under threat from revisionist Zionism, which is a much more right-wing philosophy founded by Jabotinsky here, which broke with mainstream Labour Zionism in 1923. And here is Jabotinsky. If you wish to colonize a land, note the word colonize there, in which people are already living, you must provide a garrison for the land, meaning fortress, or find a benefactor who will maintain the garrison on your behalf. Zionism is a colonizing adventure and stands or falls by the question of armed forces. Couldn't put that much clearer, could you? And here we are, a quote from Kaplan's book, The Jewish Radical Right, and describing the way in which the revisionists regarded modern Europe and what kind of thing they would do to make it different. And it's worth having a look at this. This is quite a long program, I think about an hour-long documentary on the Jewish war, meaning the armed struggle waged by Stern Gang, Lehi, the Irgun, against the British presence. And that this documentary gives a long sort of history of that process of the involvement of the Irgun, for example, in armed violence, and in particular the bombing of the King David Hotel, but many other events. And it's full of interviews with British soldiers and police, and also with members of the Irgun who talk about their involvement in the killing of the civilians in the King David Hotel. And there's the picture of the King David Hotel bombed by the Irgun in 1946. 91 people died. Headlines from the day. And here's Yitzhak Shamir of the Stern Gang of Lehi. Neither Jewish ethnic nor Jewish tradition can disqualify terrorism as a means of combat. We are far from having any moral qualms as far as our national war goes. We're particularly far from any qualms with regard to the enemy's moral degradation is universally admitted here. Blood-curdling stuff. First and foremost, says he has hit the front, the journals of the resistance, the underground. But first and foremost, terrorism is for us part of the political battle being conducted under present circumstances. It has a great part to play, speaking in a clear voice to the whole world, as well as our wretched brethren outside this land. It proclaims our war against the occupier. Now, interesting there, isn't it? The word terrorism, they accept the word terrorism for themselves, and they also refer to the occupier, by which they don't mean the Palestinians, they mean the British. Have in that sentence, that passage, there is nothing about the Palestinians. You wouldn't know there was such a thing as the Palestinians in that sentence, of course. And here is the question of terrorists or freedom fighters. Begin, who planned and executed the bombing of the King David Hotel, shaking hands with Thatcher. At the time, she, in the documents released in the Public Records Office, that she's very reluctant to shake his hand because of his involvement in what she described as terrorism, i.e. the killing of the civilians in the King David Hotel. And here's the Likud manifesto from 1977, Likud being the revisionist Zionist political party, which wins power for the first time in 1978, talking about the need to exterminate the PLO. Again, blood-curdling stuff. And that's us at the end of this first section. We'll come on to talk about the period since 1977 and 78 and how it relates to the question of terrorism and the question of understanding whether the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a matter of settler colonialism, of national liberation, or indeed of competing nationalisms. So I'll see you again in a moment with the other commentary. Bye-bye. And welcome back to this second session of the talk on Israel-Palestine. So this is us after the rise of Likud and its win in the 1978 general election in Israel. And what we're going to talk about now is this whole the creation of the idea of the threat of terrorism. We've seen that the Irgun and the Stern Gang Lehi were involved in what they called terrorism at the time. But of course, what happens by the period from 78 to 79 onwards is the creation of the idea that terrorism was something which was caused by non-state groups in particular, but that these were groups which were sponsored by and large, or thought to be in some kind of complex network by the Soviet Union. And so that was the idea of the terror network, the international terror networks supported by the Soviets. And in this period also, we have the beginning of the idea that there is some relationship between terrorism and Islam. And this, of course, is something which is built on over the years, but only becomes a major theme of Western policy after 9/11, of course. But we can see the early stages of it in this period. So here we go. The Reagan-Likud in the first war on terror. And we start with the Jerusalem conference in July 79 as Menachem Begin, the former bomb maker, mastermind of the King David Hotel attack, and then Prime Minister in 1978. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel, but who at that stage was engaged in a thing called the Jonathan Institute, an organization named after his brother who was killed in a raid on a hijacked plane in Entebbe. And he ran this conference. He was the force behind the conference. And it was a key international conference which welded together Israeli state interests with British and to some extent, with American and to some extent British state interests and terror experts. It was the intolerable spectacle of legitimization of terror groups and the frequent capitulation to their demands that made the Jerusalem conference so necessary. The UN is hopelessly incapable. The Western governments have too often tried to make deals with the terrorists. In the face of such paralysis, pusillanimity, and impotence, the Jerusalem Conference was convened to begin the formation of an anti-terror alliance in which the democracies of the world, in which all the democracies of the West must join. Now, a clear statement of the attempt to align Western powers against terror, forgetting, of course, the terror that the government, people in the government had been engaged in by their own account previously. So Israel takes a position as an ally with Ronald Reagan, with the US. They want to delegitimize Palestinian nationalism and the armed struggle for statehood, and legitimize Israeli occupation and their policies in the occupied Palestinian territories in the Middle East. So there's the invasion in this particular period, the invasion of Lebanon, the Shabra and Shatila massacres overseen by the Israelis, 2,000 Palestinian refugees killed. And then, of course, there is the whole question of Netanyahu's framing of Palestinian terrorism as an attempt to isolate your enemy from time and from causality and from prior action. Okay, that's Edward Said. And involved in this process, Reagan's vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush's dad, who had previously been the head of the CIA, and Brian Crozier, the British covert action operative very close to Thatcher. And here's Lord Chalfont, a former Labour minister, very close to this collection of Atlanticist, proto-neoconservative ideologues, and Claire Sterling, famously, who wrote the terror network, the Soviet terror network, which was, as the CIA said when they were asked to investigate, based on CIA disinformation, which she had uncritically reproduced. And here was Alexander Haig, he was the one who went to the CIA and said, look, this is a fantastic book by Claire Sterling. And the CIA said, no, it's not. And we made these things up. And you can read about this in the blog there by Adam Curtis on the Pope and the Axis of Terror. And here, Ronald Reagan's terrorism network, the same people. Now, so that's the first terror network. And we should remember that in the second Jerusalem conference, which was held in Washington, D.C., that was the stage at which the question of Islam and terrorism became a thing and was talked about at a particular session at that conference. And that was the beginnings of the idea that Islam had some particular relationship to terrorism, something which came from the second Jonathan Institute conference held in Washington. And of course, Israel positions itself as a key ally in the second war on terror after 9/11. There's an immediate context, which is the Second Intifada, the Palestinian uprising between 2000 and 2003, which led to deaths of over 2,000 Palestinians and 827 Israeli deaths. And here's Netanyahu on 9/11. It's very good, he said. And then he said, oh, well, it's not very good, but it will generate immediate sympathy. He predicted it would strengthen the bond between our two peoples because we've experienced terror over so many decades that the United States has now experienced a massive hemorrhaging of terror. Continuing post 9/11 violence, 13 Israeli soldiers, 61 civilians, 241 Palestinian fighters and civilians were killed. And there's the data from B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, comparing the 2,316 Palestinians with the 827 Israelis. But is terrorism an appropriate term to use for the Israel-Palestine conflict? Can it be rescued from its uses in webs of propaganda? Is it worth doing so? I think the only thing to say at this present moment is to say that armed violence is clearly armed violence, and how you describe it is a matter, to some extent, of politics. And really, the question is what kinds of political principles you use to analyze political violence. Do you use a kind of rights-based, human rights-based, international law-based definition, or do you use a more obviously biased political definition? I think those are the key questions. And here we have the Interdisciplinary Centre in Herzliya, named after Herzl, of course, and their Institute for Counterterrorism. You should look at their video. It takes a network to catch a network, which is quite interesting. It's on the YouTube link there. And here, commemoration to the King David Hotel bombing. Now we go to Operation Cast Lead, in 2008 to 2009. Different figures there of the numbers of deaths. The Israelis give the lowest number. The Palestinian Ministry of Health gives the highest number. And you can see the large numbers of non-combatants who were killed in that period. Now, in the study which Mike Berry and Greg Filo did, they analysed the way in which TV news covered Israel. Ending the rockets, need for security, stop smuggling of weapons, key BBC theme. The aim is to hit Hamas. Hamas and the terrorists are to blame. Only 14.5 lines of text refer to the military occupation, 10.5 on ending the blockade, siege of Gaza. So you can see the very strong bias that there is against the Palestinians in television news coverage. And in terms of what people thought about this, how they believed, again, unsurprising finding TV news a primary source of information about the conflict for the public. There are gaps in audiences and audience understanding, public opinion of the conflict, and these tend to parallel exactly the gaps in the news. We can see they come more or less directly from the news. Because the Israeli presence is not described as a military occupation and the significance of this is not explained, it's not clear what the word occupation actually means. But is there such a thing as Israeli state terrorism? I don't mean the quote-unquote terrorism of the Irgun or the Lehi, but of the Israeli government. Is the Israeli government a terrorist organization? I mean, if you look at the headlines here, this is the flotilla attack, Israel accused of state terrorism, terrorism d'attaque, Israel is a pirate in French, etc., etc. Death in the high seas. This is, of course, the attack on the Gaza flotilla, which resulted in the Israelis killing several of the campaigners on board the boats trying to get to Gaza. Now, I mean, I think one of the things to do here is to try and take a long view, and look at the different sorts of views that are on this conflict. Try and get your head around it. Here is the promise by Peter Kuzminski. I've already mentioned this before in the video selections. This is, a long, I think it's 4-part series trying to explain the history and contemporary politics of Israel-Palestine. Well worth watching. But there are many other films to watch. There's the work of the Jewish National Fund on the left there, and of course the mirror image of that, which is the question of whether the JNF is involved not just in planting trees and being a nice environmentalist organisation, but also in ethnic cleansing. And so that's the key fault line in the debate. Pilger's, the veteran journalist John Pilger's Palestine is Still the Issue video, tough watching, but well worth it, I think. And then the question of the unworthy victims, the children, 4 young boys playing on a Gaza beach, killed in an airstrike. And these are the hard realities of the conflict in Israel-Palestine. So just to conclude then, Israel was created by a military process resulting in the expulsion of around 750,000 Palestinians, and you can read the dispute on whether that was planned or whether that was accomplished by other means. In 1967, Israel invaded and occupied more territory, following which settlements were created in both Gaza and the West Bank. Israel was allied with the US and other Western powers. So the question, which arises from that is, do we see this as settler colonialism, as a matter of settlers taking land from natives? Do we see it, on the contrary, as national liberation struggle against a colonial power, as they put it at the time? Or is it competing nationalisms in ethnic conflict? Is that a kind of halfway house of an argument, or is it just one which denies the reality of the situation on the ground? Okay, so that's the end of this session, and I will speak to you all in the seminars on Tuesday. Okay, bye-bye.